Thanks so much for joining us here at the Ministry Show again for our second show. The first show was on philosophy of ministry, and we've gotten so many comments through the social media channels from you, and really appreciate the encouragement. So many of you have mentioned that it was a good reminder for why you engaged in ministry to start with, and then others have even mentioned how those 3 questions helped even refine where you're at in ministry. If you missed that show, you can go back in the archives and pick that one up. So I'd encourage you to do so. But thanks for being here with us today.
Yeah, that was a great show. Really appreciate your knowledge, Chris, and what you shared. And as we continue in this, your personal philosophy of ministry, we'll have a few anchors, but it's definitely going to be defined over time. When you say, you challenged me in that.
A time or two over the years.
Yes.
So don't be afraid to put the oar in the water, so to speak, and just get going. It'll refine over time. This week, we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff. The real focus, though, is the value of a volunteer. And I'm often asked the question, well, who's more important, a visitor or a volunteer? I probably get that question 2 or 3 times a week as I'm coaching pastors and church leaders throughout the country. And so what we decided to do was, hey, let's answer that question. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Pam? Is that worthwhile?
It is worthwhile.
Well, let's first talk about what is of value in like a volunteer. Now, I know we could come up with a laundry list. There could be, 15, 20, 30, 500 types of things that a volunteer is valuable for. But we're just going to talk about 3 here today. And the first one being that they're participating. Wow, have you noticed in ministry that participation tends to be pervasive? If somebody does one thing, they might do 2. If they do 2 things, they're more apt to do 3, so on and so forth. And really, as we're creating disciples, as we're focusing on the Great Commission, it's participation that brings about the change, the development, and the spiritual maturity.
Right. Also, building ministry, it's giving them opportunities to use their gifts. There's nothing more frustrating than having gifts that are squandered, that you can't use, or you don't feel, maybe you feel frustrated that you're not able to use. It's also a higher level of getting to know people, caring for them, doing life with them. So a lot of win-wins with volunteers.
Yeah, and really it's in those higher levels of knowing people and then caring for them that those famous one another's of Scripture happen anyway. Love one another, care for one another, admonish one another, so on and so forth. Your volunteers engaged in ministry, participating is a key element to overall spiritual growth. And we're not even mentioning the actual work that gets done, but of course, they do a lot of work, right? Let's talk also about 3 values of a visitor. Now, again, there's more than 3. We know and understand that. You might even want to take some time with your team, determine in your ministry circles, in your sphere of influence at your church, identify 3 or 4 values that a volunteer brings, but then also a visitor brings. The first one that comes to my mind on the value of a visitor is just potential. There are people we don't know maybe yet or haven't been able to engage with, and there's just a ton of potential there. Mm-hmm. Potential help, potential ministry opportunity, potential everything. So visitors are filled with potential.
Well, and also I think it brings excitement to your church. I know whenever we have new visitors, we're just excited. We're excited to hear their story, about them, to build that relationship. They go out and tell friends about us. It's healthy for church growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're getting visitors, it means that people in your community are somehow finding out about your church, either through personal acquaintance, word on the street, whatever it might be. The last huge value that I see in a visitor is each and every visitor, of course, represents other visitors because they have a sphere of influence that you and I don't have. They're coming, I hate to use terms like this, I don't want to be us, them, but they are coming from the outside. They're a visitor.
Right.
So they have webs of relationships and influence that goes beyond your current sphere of influence.
Well, when you think of visitors, I always think of when I go to a great movie, I'm not promoting it to friends because I'm so excited about the movie or whatever it is, a great restaurant. So visitors tend to be your biggest promoters.
We want to also talk then about how do we translate this or what does it actually mean? your numerical growth at your church is going to be due almost exclusively to new visitors. Mm-hmm. Unless you're counting on birth rate to expand your ministry and, have a huge nursery. So it is imperative that we understand that numerical growth is primarily going to be due to visitors.
Right. If you're not having visitors coming, your congregation is eventually going to grow old and die. There's no life. You have to have that continual growth in your church. People grow because of an act of serving. Training's part of what we provide for volunteers, for opportunities to connect with others that they serve with us. Some of my best friends that I have today are those that I've met while serving.
Most of the spiritual growth in your church is going to be due to volunteers. Mm-hmm. There's just no way of getting around it. There might be a visitor now and then that can bring an extra dose of spiritual maturity. Maybe they moved into your town from a different town and so on and so forth. But primarily, that spiritual growth is going to happen due to the volunteers because they're highly participating in your ministries. We think, and I personally think, I shouldn't speak for you, Pam, that it's important when it comes to growth to focus on both numerical growth and personal spiritual growth. So it's a both and kind of world in that regard.
Right. But we're also talking about passions here too, and what opportunities that we give for people to serve in your church that they're passionate about. I was thinking of my friend Kim the other day. She's now my friend. I met her several years ago and interviewed her, and we sat and talked. My interviews basically were sitting down, talking, getting to know people. And one of the questions I ask is, what's your passion? Sometimes they don't have a clue, but in talking with them, you can start to see sparks unite. Sometimes they need us to come and pull that out of them. And Kim started sharing about this church in the San Diego area where you're from. It was called JAM, Junior Arts Ministry, and she just came alive in our conversation. And I said, so tell me about that ministry. She did, and I said, all right, well, we're going to get it started here. What do you need? And I came in and got the finances and helped her and supporting her to develop that team. That became probably the most impactful ministry in children's ministry on children's lives as well as our community. Became a huge outreach because you got to hear their passions and think outside the box. And how can you use that to make it so that they're going to serve in a place where it could really impact your city?
So then I suppose that Kim, over that time period, you could see her growing into who the Lord wanted her to be as well. In other words, spiritual growth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they were new to our church. So what did it do? I mean, they became like a core in our church. They went from visitor literally within months to just this huge pillar of a leader in our church, which was great.
Okay, so I have a question for you.
Okay.
In that instance with Kim, she knew already what she was passionate about. Mm-hmm. So she had already had a level of experience that gave her confidence about herself, about her talents and all that, where she knew it. How do you work with somebody they don't yet know maybe where their passion lies or what they'd be most enthusiastic about in ministry?
Well, that was me. So when I got saved, I had no clue. I'm like, passion, my dad taught me to be a hard worker and be committed and take passion wherever I went. So I had to learn that. I would say start serving somewhere. That's what I did. I noticed a need, wanted to fill it. Another way I would say is ask God. He knows you. He's created you. He knows the gifts he's given you. Pray about it. Ask him to reveal that, and he will. And then ask others that know you well, that really know who you are, if they haven't already spoken that. I've had many people come and speak things over me that have lined up, that's been consistent in my gifts, and that helped me to get the confidence to step into those places.
Good. So let's go back then and talk just for a few minutes about where's your focus. Do you tend to have a focus, maybe a passion, on visitors? Or is it more on volunteers? I'm going to take the focusing on visitors piece. If we focus only on one side of that equation or another, on a visitor over a volunteer or a volunteer over a visitor, what happens is an imbalance within our ministry. And at some point, that imbalance is going to show itself in either turmoil, kind of that internal angst that can happen with one group or one faction within a church feeling maybe a little bit underserved or underutilized or whatever. And by the way, for those of you listening, that's nothing new. Read the first 10 chapters of the book of Acts. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Things were growing, things were changing, things were happening. And all of a sudden there's groups of people that are like, hey, what about me? What about me? What about me? So that's normal and natural. I want to talk about the focus if you only focus on volunteers. And the reason why is my bent in life is expansion oriented. I want to help expand the kingdom. And so I'm always thinking about what's out there. Here's what I know. What's out there is more than what's in here. And it doesn't matter where in here is. It doesn't matter if your church is 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. There's always more out there. My natural bent would be more to focus on visitors because of the potential that's there. But if you do that, first of all, it is a good thing. But if it is your only focus, it's a telltale sign that your ministry will be one of burnout and turnover. How do I know that? Scar tissue.
You'll have it.
I've got plenty of the scar tissue because early on in ministry, that's where my focus was. And I was completely imbalanced about those in the ministry that were volunteering to make things happen. The other thing that I found out was such a heavy focus on only visitors is I was really acting out of an area of giftedness for me, and it was super hard to articulate things in a way that would help other people see the imaginary thing. What I mean by that is visitors are imaginary at some point. Like we don't know until they show up who they are, or they fill out some response form or whatever, and then we can kind of get to know them. So it was really, for a lot of people, a figment of their imagination because it wasn't real. It was only potential. And so it kind of painted me in a corner as a leader early on of being pie in the sky. If you'll build it, they will come, all that kind of a thing. That created at least an imbalance in that regard in ministry. Pam, you've had some experience on, well, what if you focus only on volunteers? What's the counterbalance to what I just explained?
Yeah, and I think that's probably where I fell a little bit short there, is I tend to focus more on volunteers. In doing that, you can neglect the needs of others. Unintentionally, you just can, because your focus is on those volunteers and not seeing, like you say, the bigger picture. It's also a tendency to raise the bar of participation a little too high. You tend, if you're focused on your volunteers, you think everyone needs to volunteer, or they're volunteering so great, now I can raise that bar and maybe put too much expectation on a few or your teams. We also can fall into the risk of the Martha syndrome, where we're doing, and we're becoming that trap of task-oriented. And I know that, I can fall into that. I don't know about you.
So us guys don't have to worry about that because
you're not Martha.
Anyway.
I think there are a lot of men that fall into the Martha syndrome. But we can do that unintentionally.
Here's the answer from our perspective, and that is that you have a healthy perspective. You got to know naturally where you lean. You're going to lean one way or another, more than likely, just like I did. But the healthy perspective is know where I land and then help empower the counterbalance of that, so that organizationally we are focused on both and not either or.
Right.
It strikes me that our Great Commission from the Lord has the go and the teach to obey.
Right.
So the go, well, we have to be kind of extroverted to go. We have to get out of our comfort zone and go out there. But then also the internal focus is teach to obey. I found over time it's a lot harder. It's hard enough to go, but it's a lot harder to teach to obey than it is to go. That healthy perspective will be one of balance, not for you personally. You need to acknowledge where you're at, but then build a team that's a healthy balance.
Right. And I would say, to gain perspective on that, take a walk around your church, especially if you're a senior pastor. You're seeing what goes on Sunday mornings, you're teaching. It's kind of a narrow focus. But as you walk around, get someone to teach on a Sunday, preach that morning, and walk around your church and see whether it's visitor or volunteer, what's their perspective when they come into your church. See how volunteers are serving in that ministry and what they're doing. I think it'll excite you. If nothing else, you get to see what's going on all over the church. For me, I had to go to lunch with some of my key volunteers to hear and keep things in perspective, because you always think things are great, but you want to be able to have that iron sharpens iron and then speak into your life. Are there any frustrations? Where am I falling short, or where are we falling short as a ministry team? I want it to always be we and not me or you. And also, I think putting your money where your mouth is. I've seen sometimes where you can look at where money is allocated, and are we using budgets to bless our volunteers? If we were paying for them to serve, if we had to pay staff it would be overwhelming. So volunteers need to be appreciated, and put your money where your mouth is.
Put your money where your mouth is. So I think the key really lies in empowering others instead of trying to make them like me. Yeah. Oh my gosh, this was another hard lesson for me to learn in ministry. I'm glad I learned it earlier in ministry rather than later. But instead of trying to make everybody a carbon copy or be upset at people if they weren't passionate about what I was passionate about, skilled at the same things I was skilled at, I learned to empower others versus just try to make them a carbon copy of me. Right. And there's so much tension when I would try to make other people be interested in what God made me interested in as far as expansion, moving the ball down the field, when they had different set of giftings that were really anchored in knowing one another, caring for one another, and some of those types of things. There is a big difference between empowerment, which means divesting of your authority and actually giving somebody that authority permanently, and delegating, which is a temporary release of that authority. So you have it while you're teaching a class or while you're on the campus. That goes back and forth. So empowering is really about divesting your authority and having it rest in somebody else's lap. Right. And then, of course, they're either going to sink or swim.
That's right.
They're going to make you look bad.
Right.
And then they might make you look good.
Right.
But we got to get comfortable with they're going to make you look bad first, a la Peter. I won't say anything more about that. We'll save that for another show. What I mean is Peter, the Apostle Peter,
yes.
By the way, not if your name's Peter.
Whom I relate to most. And empowering costs you more at the beginning, but it pays back so much more in the end. Delegation gives you a quicker fix, but the responsibility is always greater. Just, going back to Kim, I could have easily said, well, we really have a need to work in this ministry. And she would have been willing to do it. She would have jumped right in. Been met. But I don't know that she would have been as fulfilled or felt as empowered as handing her literally the keys to a ministry that her heart was attached to and watching her go for it. And it was awesome. I was blessed by it. Not only the families, but I just sat back and went, wow, to see somebody thrive in their gifts like that, it built my faith.
Well, let's just go back real quick to that whole philosophy of ministry thing. Because what you just told me, you're at your core, one of your philosophical viewpoints on ministry is to empower others. Might take a little bit longer and the takeoff's a little bit slower, but the return is significantly more. It's kind of the law of the harvest.
Yeah, it is. You probably don't know this, Chris. I don't know if I shared it with you, but in talking in this area, I saw this gentleman who really liked him, great personality, and he had a Bible that was written in Greek. And I walked by and I said, you read a Bible in Greek? And he said, I love.
Was he from Greece?
No, no. He's from actually your area again, San Diego, where all these great leaders in the San Diego area. But he said, I love Greek. I studied in college. And so he's reading this Bible to me. And I saw his passion. So I said, hey, would you be interested in leading a group of kids that this may become their passion? And we'll call it as Greek to me, kind of a fun name. And he goes, sure. So I created a ministry based on a passion I saw in somebody else. And it took off. The kids loved it.
Oh, man.
And he made it come alive. I mean, I started loving Greek because of him.
You're weird.
I know. But I was like, I see it now.
Well, let's move on to an action item that I think will help you immensely in this area. Specifically, again, talking about visitor or volunteer. We've got to assess, honestly and accurately, where do we land? Am I more drawn to the volunteer side of it, or am I more drawn to the visitor side of it? Both are important, but they're important for different reasons. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out. First of all, one of our sponsors, Aware 3, they have this thing called Text to Act that helps with all of this. Matter of fact, if you have visitors and they use this Text to Act feature in Aware 3, I know people that were looking for volunteers. They do the Text to Act, and y'all know that people are using mobile devices more than anything today. It will help your church be like in the modern age. And talk about engaging young people. They use their phones to engage with you. So Aware 3 has got this wired. You can check out what they have to offer in this area just by clicking the link. When it comes to your own self-assessment, don't change yourself. This is not about you changing or flipping to the other side. This is about you understanding God does not want you to change. God wants you to focus on where He has your heart. And then invite other people in and have them pick up the other side of that so that that balance happens between visitor and volunteers. But you have to know and be comfortable with yourself so that you can find and empower the counterbalance. The point then is authenticity. In our world today, man, authenticity trumps everything. Everything. So revisit your own personal philosophy of ministry. Again, you can look at how we talked about that in the archive. It was the first show. That'll help you with the questions part of it. But just, hey, if you're visitor focused, go get them. If you're volunteer focused, go serve them.
Yeah.
And your entire ministry is going to thrive when you focus on where the Lord has you and you empower the counterbalance so that you become more holistic. So take the next 5 or 6 minutes or so and really assess for yourself, where do I land?
Right.
And why? And then think of people who are different than you. They actually might even, I hate to say this, they might rub you the wrong way sometimes. You might be a little bit frustrated with them because they really don't see the world the way that you do. You need to go have lunch with that person or breakfast or coffee or whatever. Find out why they tick, like you did with Kim.
Right.
And empower that person. Say, hey, let's link together in ministry so that not only are we growing in numbers of people that we're able to introduce to the Lord, but we're also growing in the spiritual maturity and engaging people in the work of the kingdom. Man, you do that, and that is foundational to have a thriving ministry.
Right.
So, man, I wish we had more time because I could go on this one. Thank you so much for joining us this week. And then next week, we're going to be talking about what are the habits that it takes for you to build a thriving ministry. Now, I use the word thriving ministry a lot, so I'm going to define it here real quick. And then we can unpack that a little bit maybe next week. But thriving ministry is this. It works so well that at some point in the future, it's not instant, but at a future point, it self-perpetuates. Oh, my goodness. Talk about fun times in ministry. When we do all the work of starting it out, all that it takes to kind of get that engine going and that flywheel going and so on, when we start seeing the returns like you did with Kim, it's a beautiful thing. We'll see you next week on the Ministry Show. Thanks so much for being part of it. God bless you guys. We'll see you next week.